everyone. For this week, something really interesting. It's Franz Kafka's novella, The Metamorphosis. It's, um, it's something very different from what we've been reading. Kafka is very different as a writer. The story, in terms of its content, is very different from the things we've been reading. There's, I think, finally maybe a big change from the things that we've done before. The location in Great Britain and France and Spain to this, which is located in sort of Eastern Europe, a very different place. This is around the turn of the last century, so early 1900s. And so we're getting, in terms of things we've been reading, much closer to the present day. Anyway, let's jump right into it. A little background on Kafka himself. Kafka he wrote a lot, and he often wrote about things that were alienating and bizarre. And he often wrote about questions of identity. Those are the two main themes that he wrote about, and the two main things that we're going to talk about regarding the metamorphosis here. And in fact, in literary studies, really ever since Kafka, there's been a term which you may have heard, which is Kafkaesque. It is like Kafka, in other words. And what that means is something that is literally terrifying and complex and bizarre and confusing and sometimes hopeless, actually, specifically regarding questions of our own humanity, our own identity, like questions of like, who are we really, and how do we fit into our greater society or community around us? That these are the core questions that Kafka was writing about across his whole body of work, and they're really interesting to study in a number of ways in the philosophical field of existentialism, which sort of asks, who are we? Like, what does it mean to exist in any different context? And in literary studies, there are great questions about how to describe who we are and ask these really deep and fundamental questions about our society and humanity and how we should act, and these sorts of things. So this is less about form, the way poetry is. This is much more about the sort of cognitive, creative, abstract thinking that I think you'll enjoy. I think a lot of people really enjoy this sort of thing, especially compared to some of the earlier things. All right. Why was Kafka so interested in writing about these things? Well, I'll give you a couple of things that might help clarify. Young Franz was born in Prague, in what is now the Czech Republic, was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was a tumultuous place. The Kafkas were Jewish, but the Jewish community in Prague then was very divided between these two cultures, two very distinct cultures. There was a German culture on one hand and on one side, and then there was Czech culture on the other hand and the other side of town. And they were pretty different. They existed in the same place, but they were distinct cultures. They spoke different languages, which was the biggest distinguisher between them, and had different values and things like that. And even the broader Jewish community in Prague at that time was divided among these two communities. There was, as with all binary oppositions, where there are two options, one is sort of favored over the other. And in many ways, in this case, well, I guess it depends on your perspective, but in many ways, the German culture, the German language was favored as the intellectual language. It was the language in the courts and in the law. And Franz would go off eventually to study the law, and he would learn German, and he very much identified with the German culture in a lot of ways. It became, anyway, his main language. But he lived in a community in, as I said, what is now the Czech Republic. Before that, a country called Czechoslovakia, and before that, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was very much Czech. And so you can imagine that he's part of this sort of broader community, this sort of broadly German community, but it's situated within and geographically within this Czech culture. So how would you feel? He felt isolated, he felt alienated, he felt disconnected and sort of disallowed from the entire community. Even though he had his own community to some degree, there was still, I think, very much a powerful feeling of alienation where he lived. Within his own family, we had a similar dynamic. Kafka, meaning Franz Kafka, was himself from what we understand, a shy, quiet, polite young man. His mother was very much the same. He took after her in these ways. His father, however, was very much the opposite. He was apparently a sort of larger-than-life, boisterous, loud, charismatic man. Picture this sort of stereotypical used car salesman. Whether that's accurate or not, we have this image of this very boisterous, very excitable salesman, and I think that is probably a good idea for who Kafka's father was. So now you have a young man, very, very different from his father, and he's growing up in a culture where he's already separated. He's identifying more with his mother. This is then more so than now, not exactly the acceptable way for young men to grow up, right? He really should have emulated his father out of the two parents, but he doesn't. It's much more like his sort of meeker and quieter mother. So he had 4 sisters, ultimately. So you would think maybe he can turn to his siblings, right? There's a family unit of 5 children altogether, including him. So maybe he can turn to them and identify with them. But when they got into their adult lives, later they sort of grew apart. And remember the time period, remember the location. And his sisters were eventually captured by the invading Nazi party in Prague and imprisoned and put into concentration camps where they all ultimately died. And so that, in some ways, was the culture that Kafka was a part of. He was not a Nazi, he was not perpetrating these sorts of crimes, but he was connected to the Germans in a way that he wasn't connected with the Czechs. So you can imagine, probably, right, you start putting some of these pieces together. These are big pieces, and these are long-term pieces over his whole life. You can imagine why he might have felt a sense of alienation, meaning he didn't feel like he was accepted or really fully a part of some of these groups. He wasn't allowed in, or he was allowed in, but maybe didn't want to be associated with other members of that same group. And also why he was interested in these questions of identity. Like, who is he really? How do you decide? Am I German? Am I Czech? Am I German but a Nazi, or German and not a Nazi? What language do I speak? What difference does it make? What difference does it make how others see me? So if the Czech people looked on him poorly because he identified as German, does it matter? Does it change who he is in some meaningful way, or is it only a superficial way In other words, if you just simply spoke Czech rather than German, does that somehow fundamentally change his identity and make him a better person? Or is it just as simple as speaking a different language? This is how he thought. These were the questions that he asked himself. These are the questions that his characters are forced to ask of themselves, and so on. And it's really interesting stuff. It's very disturbing sometimes. And I think it does a good job of asking you, the reader, to ask these same questions, or at least to explore these questions. Even if it doesn't cause the same sort of crisis in you that it might have in Kafka, it's still interesting to think about these questions. And if you take Introduction to Philosophy with me, we will ask these questions in some detail, actually, and try to answer them for ourselves, which is a very interesting project. Okay. That's probably enough about Kafka himself. And let me just tell you a little bit about the story, the Metamorphosis. Kafka wrote a number of things. They were all, usually they were all longer works. This is one of his shorter works. They were novels, essentially. And they were often what we now call Kafkaesque. They were about characters who found themselves in bizarre situations that were complex, that forced them to ask themselves who they are and what makes them who they are, and so on. So in the Metamorphosis, it begins right away with our main character, whose name is Gregor. Gregor wakes up physically transformed into, in Kafka's word, a vermin. That's the beginning of the story, right? Right away, he wakes up and he has been transformed physically. His physical, visual appearance, his body, in other words, has been transformed into a vermin. What exactly does that mean? It's unclear, and Kafka very deliberately doesn't tell us exactly what that means. He sort of leaves this like monstrous possibility in your mind. The term has been translated from Kafka's German multiple ways. For example, enormous bug, gigantic insect, monstrous vermin, and a couple other things. It's most commonly believed that, and you can tell from the description, that this is an insect, and it's probably some kind of beetle, essentially. But Gregor's mind and his memory and his personality, at least in the very beginning, is all still the same as it was the day before when he went to sleep as a human being. Starts off as a normal human, wakes up an insect. But only the outside has changed, at least at first. And his body, continuing this sense of alienation and questionable identity, his body itself is a contradiction. His back is covered in armor, but his legs are, as it's put in the English, pitifully thin. They sort of flicker helplessly. So on the one side, picture a beetle, right? On the one side, it has this protective shell, but on the underside, it's just little tiny, frail legs. And these are sort of opposite. He's not like he's well armored all the way around or frail all the way around. He's both at the same time. After, let's see, a little bit of an introduction, we get some of the details about Gregor's life. And this is really interesting because we get to see like this human sense of alienation. I'll just give you a couple of examples here. I have a million. But just to point a few out. Gregor blames his job. He's talking about his confusion and stuff. He blames his job immediately. He says, "What a strenuous profession I have. It's turned me into a beetle. It's that stressful." He talks about the worries of traveling. He was a traveling salesman, Gregor. And he talks about train connections and irregular hours and conversations with people on these trains, but where the people are sort of constantly different. So you think about this life. He doesn't go to one office, sit in one chair, right? I mean, take, for example, the way I do, right? You see me sitting in this one chair, at this one desk, in this one office, which doesn't change all that much. It gets darker outside and it snows and things, but it's the same place. It's comforting, it's normal. He doesn't have that. Gregor gets on trains every day, goes to different places, talks to different people. It's always different. He doesn't have anything stable to centralize his identity. Whereas, let's say, I might be able to say, I'm the one who works in this office. He can't say that. He doesn't have anything solid or concrete to point to. And if any of you have ever spent any time traveling, or even if you've traveled from like place to place to place before coming back home, let's say over a couple of days or weeks, you might have that sense. It's a decentering when you don't have a sense of home. And that's what he's talking about here. Let's see. Then Gregor goes on to blame his parents. He says, if it wasn't for my parents, I wouldn't even have this job. He's only working this job to pay off debt for his parents. He's being a nice guy. Like, he's trying to be nice, but he's found himself in this world that has decentered him. It's not even him, he's saying. He said he can't even call in sick. There's no way out. You'll see as you read this, the company he works for has essentially a health insurance doctor where, and imagine this in your own life. Imagine you call in sick. They send the doctor to your house to investigate whether you're actually sick or not. And if you're not sick, they take you to work and make you work. So you could never just call in and say, I'm not coming in, I need a break. They come get you. This would be maddening, as you can imagine, without ever being able to get away. Okay, let's see. As this is all going on, as Gregor's discovering that he's now an insect, tries to communicate with his parents and he can't. This is all very symbolic, right? That's why I'm pointing these ones out. In the actual story, he can't communicate. He's trying, but because he's an insect, he literally can't. His parents don't speak insect, and so they can't communicate. And this is all very symbolic of this message he's getting across, the difficulty of communicating with other people and how alienating and decentering it can feel. The inability to get away, so the chief clerk from his office comes out to investigate and essentially tries to bring him to work. And you get this sense, right? If you don't already, I think at this point, you, the reader, get this sense that he just can't get away. This would be so stressful all the time. This inability to communicate, inability to just be himself. All right. That's all the beginning. I'll just say a word maybe about how it goes in the beginning, and then I'm going to let you read this for yourself. But you'll see that what happens through the middle sections is Gregor becomes more and more like an insect. In the beginning, he's a regular person. He just has the body of an insect. And then all of a sudden, he starts climbing the walls. And he doesn't like his people food, for lack of a better word. He only likes the kind of food that insects would like. And on the one hand, he kind of thinks and feels the same way that he would, right? We have this insight into his mind and his thoughts. But on the other hand, he starts to lose his identity as a human being. And this is one of the things that's really interesting. The more his family sees him as an insect, and the more they treat him as an insect, the more he becomes an insect. Even though we can see very clearly in the beginning, his mind is the mind of a human being. His mind is the same mind that he had before. All that's changed is his physical appearance. But we know that because we can see his thoughts. His parents in the story can't see his thoughts. They can't communicate. All they see is his outward appearance, the beetle, so they're afraid. They treat him like a beetle. They can't get through and treat him as a human being. So what happens? He becomes more of a beetle and less of a human being because of the way he's being treated from the outside. It's powerful stuff. If you remember that this obviously is not just a simple story about a man changing into a beetle. This is no children's story. This is very much an adult story where Kafka, the writer, is exploring this. And in some way, he's making a statement about the important effect of the way people treat you. He's saying, if you treat somebody like a beetle, they're going to act like a beetle. And maybe they're going to become a beetle. Now, change beetle to something else. And maybe you can see what he's getting at, what Kafka is afraid of. And it's a scary thing. It's powerful. And that's his point. This is the feeling of the Kafkaesque. It's bizarre and confusing, and there's no way out, and you can feel trapped. And Kafka's basically saying this is what life is like. He's sort of pessimistic in this way. He's saying this is what life is like. It's hard, it's confusing, it's bizarre. It's impossible sometimes to communicate with other people. And the way other people treat you has an enormous effect on who you are, how you feel, who you become, what your value is, and a great number of other things. So that's all I'll say. Probably more than enough for right now. After all that, do pay attention to Gregor's sister, Greta. She's a very interesting character, very different from the mother and father. The mother's sort of a middle ground character between sister on one hand, father on the other, mother somewhere in the middle. Right? She has a transformative experience. Do pay attention to the sister and how she treats her brother, Gregor. All right, that's it. Do plan on having some time to read this. It is fairly long. It's a novella. It's a short. It's like a long short story, is how I'll put it. It's in the document that I'm giving you on Blackboard. It's 18 pages with 2 columns per page, so it's like 36 pages. It's not that long, but it will take some time to read. It's divided into 3 sections, so you can read one section at a time. But I do want you to read the whole thing before you take the week's reading quiz. So give it some time, a couple hours at least, I would think. All right, that's really it for now. There's a lot to say about this. We could really spend weeks on this if we wanted to. Just pay close attention and try to get a sense for like the differences here between like what Kafka's doing and some of the older stuff that we were reading the slave narratives and poetry and Blake's romantic imagery and things like that. We've entered the 20th century. We've entered the period of the Holocaust writing, essentially, and things are pretty different. So, as always, happy reading. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns or anything along the way, and I hope you enjoy this one. Okay, talk to you later.